Hello and welcome to Feedstuffs 365 and National Hog Farmer. I'm Ann Hess. The Pork Checkoff has developed a long-standing international market development strategy to build confidence in U.S. pork with the crucial partnership and activation of the U.S. Meat Export Federation. Joining us to discuss this strategy and partnership is Andy Tower, National Pork Board Vice President of International Market Development, and Dan Halstrom, USMEF CEO and President. Welcome to you both, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Ann.
Before we jump into today's discussion, I'd like to remind the audience tuning in, if you have any questions, you can post them at any time in the chat, or if you're tuning in via social media, you can post those there in the comments. So Andy, let's kick off this conversation by maybe having you give a brief overview of U.S. pork's strategy to diversify cuts, develop emerging markets, and even differentiate from competitors.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think really this is kind of one of our core functions at National Pork Board, and really falls in line with one of our new strategic initiatives that the board came out with, driving and increasing long-term value of pork. And so, as we think about the international arena that gets about 30% of the domestic production, it's really about how do we find those partners around the globe that see the value that U.S. pork brings to the table. I mean, with our consistent product, food safety. And so this is where we've really leaned on, our partners at USMEF to help us kind of work through that strategy. We've got a lot of great long-term partners in the international arena, but really have focused over the last handful of years on diversifying and developing those newer markets, while we continue to maintain strong partnerships with customers in Mexico, Japan, South Korea, but looking at those emerging economies like Colombia and some others in that Central American region to really develop further. And so this is really, all about, getting the best value for the entire hog. And so, and the great thing about the international arena, a lot of those international customers like the parts and pieces that our domestic consumer doesn't historically have on their dinner plate. So it's a great win-win for both sides, and really helps the overall value of the hog back here domestically. But, a lot of it couldn't be done without Dan and his team, that partnership. I mean, with all their experts around the globe helping guide and advise us as we make those investments year over year on behalf of the U.S. pork farmer.
Yeah, a lot of opportunities there with some of those cuts that are just not familiar on our plates. And Dan, how does USMEF use input from the National Pork Board as well as your own team leaders to build confidence in U.S. pork?
Yeah, thank you, Ann. First of all, I'd like to say partnering with the National Pork Board and the pork industry in general is just a phenomenal relationship that we've had for many, many years. And we're very appreciative to be part of that formula. I think I'll give you a couple of examples of how we've partnered, and there's a lot of examples. But in the context of diversifying the carcass, maximizing the value of the product cutout, you look at variety meats. We're going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of $8.5 billion for 2025 of exported pork product. And about 14% of that is variety meats, or about $1.3 billion. So as you had already alluded to, a lot of cases, these variety meats are not items that are consumed here in the U.S. And I think working with our offices around the world to, whether it be pork feet, stomachs, snoots, ears, pork brains, in markets like Mexico, Peru, Chile, Korea, Japan. I mean, I think that's a pretty good formula. The other thing is, you look at on the primal cut side, and this is working closely with Pork Board as well over the years. We all know that the loin primal in general is undervalued, and we've spent a lot of time diversifying our market focus on loins. Japan's been a huge buyer of loins for decades. But you look at other markets like a Mexico, a Korea, Philippines, a Colombia, 5, 6 years ago, a lot of these markets didn't buy hardly any loins from the U.S., and now they're regular customers. A lot of that is due to that input from the pork board and working closely together. And then finally, probably the best example I have on country diversification and the emergence of some of these emerging regions. Once again, you look back to 2010 when I started at USMEF, just coincidentally, some of the first topics we had were some of these emerging markets, and one of them was Colombia. So we decided to put effort and resources behind expanding the presence in Colombia. And in Colombia, exports of U.S. pork were around $18 to $20 million. Last year, or I should say 2025, more like $360 million. So that's 20 times the size of the market in 2010. So that to me is the best example of really going out and developing an emerging region.
That's quite a jump there in traffic and shipments going there from U.S. pork. That's amazing. As we look over the last year, I'd like to, ask both of you to just maybe give an example of a successful in-market activation from 2025.
So I think, and Dan kind of touched on that Colombian market. I think one that we talk about a lot, and quite frankly is starting to generate some interest even back here in our domestic market, is the Boston Butt Burger campaign that I think really started in that Colombian market, but now is moving in other South American and Latin American markets. And so that's one that's just, as we think about how we can leverage those learnings both in the international market and the domestic marketplace, is one that I know our board of directors talks about a lot, and there's a lot of excitement around that because, seems like every month, every quarter, as we read the reports from Dan and his team, that campaign is picking up in another market. And so it's really catching on well. As we think about the Boston Butt, here domestically, that's more, we think, pulled pork, smoked up opportunities, but as we see it in those international arenas, grinding that into a burger is really taking off well. And as I said, I think we're starting to see some interest in recreating that here, even domestically.
You've had some success there, and there's no reason to, I suppose, recreate the wheel. Dan, go ahead.
Yeah, I think there's quite a few examples, and Andy had a really good one. We're seeing that Boston Butt Burger spread to beyond just Colombia now into Central America. Places like Japan even have featured it in fine dining in Japan. So that's a success. But I'm going to go back to the loin. We had some good news come in just recently. We had a family-style dining chain in Japan called Washoku, 201 family-style dining restaurants. And late last year, October, November, we rolled out a promotion with them where they put on their menu an exclusive U.S. pork loin tonkatsu meal. And it was new for them. They didn't feature it before, and they used some domestic pork, but they decided to really put the push on and feature it in all 201 restaurants. And that's resulted in about 200 metric tons a month of additional business. So that just gives you an example of, someone that was using in a small way, focusing on the loin tonkatsu, has now really not only switched supplies to the U.S., but increased their volume.
As much as we want to celebrate, these successes, we have to, mention there has been some challenges this past year with, tariffs and even some roadblocks in China. Dan, how has U.S. pork worked to address some of these issues?
Yeah, there's been a lot of, I refer to it the last 12 months as a lot of noise, right? We have the different things, tariff related, non-tariff related, reciprocal trade agreements. You've got a strong U.S. dollar for the first half of 2025, which really was a headwind in Asia, especially. Now, the last quarter of 2025 and into early 2026, we've seen a little bit of a reversal there, which has helped. But definitely that was a headwind the first 8 or 9 months of 2025. And I think another item that is really becoming more and more, not really so much a challenge, but we need to be aware of it, is the international competition. We are not the only country that's figured out the value of exports, the $65 to $70 a head that they represent. We're starting to see increasing competition from some of our neighbors as close as Canada, for example, into places like Japan and Mexico, and also Brazil. Brazilian pork into Mexico, Japan, Korea, Philippines, and China. They're really becoming an issue there. And how do we address it? I think sometimes the best defense is a good offense. And I'm going to use Mexico as the example. But we've identified this is not new information. We're becoming increasingly aware and concerned with the presence of Brazilian pork in Mexico. And we have by far the largest market share of imported pork, 80+%. Canada and Mexico traditionally, or I should say Canada traditionally is the number 2 supplier. They have fallen back now, and Brazil is the number 2 supplier into Mexico. So one of the ways we address this, I'm being more offensive in terms of proactiveness, is we approached Pork Board last year for a supplemental that focused just on Mexico and some additional funding. And the purpose of that was to really go in and shore up some of the relationships on the aggressive side with more presence of U.S. pork. So I think, like I said, one of the offensive maneuvers is to be more proactive and get a more stronger share and presence with some of these key accounts in Mexico.
So Andy, as we maybe get out the crystal ball, look into the horizon, say in the next 5-10 years, where are the opportunities? What are the focal points for maintaining and increasing international demand?
So I think Dan really hit the nail on the head in terms of an offensive strategy. And as we think about some of these core markets that have been really good for the United States pork producers, Mexico, Japan, South Korea, I mean, doubling down and really playing offense there. And so we can maintain and continue to grow our market share there. But I also think, as you just look at the sheer demographics, I mean, Southeast Asia is an area that, huge population growth there and growing incomes. And so that's an area that we'll continue to focus on. And there's been some positive announcements from the administration in terms of some of those key markets in that region as well here in the last few months. And then I think the other one that, and I know Dan and the team is starting to do more work there all the time, but we have to think about that African continent. And so if you look down that 10, 20 year time horizon, that's where the population centers are going to be. And so how do we start to lay the seeds today to position U.S. pork to be one of the main suppliers into that region as we get further down the road? But overall, I think it's really focused on that, defend those core markets that we have today, and then look to how do we diversify and displace maybe some of those competitors that Dan had mentioned with U.S. pork as we go forward. But I really think there's some huge upside opportunities for U.S. pork in the future.
Dan, I'll have you weigh in and just maybe say how those focus points maybe align with USMEF's vision.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I think if I step back and when I'm looking to the future, the situation we're in today is that global consumption of pork is growing, and in some regions of the world growing extremely fast. Mexico, for example, from 2020 to 2025, we've seen a 38% growth in per capita consumption of pork. I think there's several reasons for that. Demand is there for pork globally. I think the global beef situation is part of that formula. We have a very low supply and a high price on beef globally, not only in the U.S., but globally. I think the pork value proposition is very attractive. But also you look for the demand out there for innovation and convenience. Pork muscle cuts and pork variety meats are fitting better into the center of the plate all the time. We've seen it already in places like Mexico, Canada, and Japan. But as Andy alluded to, the emerging regions, we're starting to even see it in. Guatemala stands out. Whoever thought that some of the higher prices in the last year, that Guatemala would be buying pork the way they have been, but they have. It's been amazing. And we already talked about Colombia. And there's other parts of Southeast Asia that Andy mentioned. I think Malaysia, Philippines, these are exciting places for U.S. pork. And in Central America, Guatemala, of course, but the other areas, Dominican Republic, Panama, et cetera. It's just really exciting out there. And in the longer term opportunity of Africa, I totally support Andy's comments there. I mean, 5 to 10 years from now, we're going to be talking a lot more about pork in the context of Africa.
As we wrap up our discussion, I'd like to ask both of you any key takeaways, final thoughts to leave our audience with here today. Andy, I'll start with you.
So I think the one thing that we didn't highlight, but I want to make sure that the listeners are aware of, as we invest those pork checkoff dollars into USMEF, they're able to leverage those with market access funds and really a 1-for-1. And so we get double that investment when they leverage those dollars. And so that allows us to really carry out, Dan and his team, to carry out these programs on that international stage and really help to push U.S. pork further into those international arenas. And I think that's so vitally important that we have that partnership with USDA, and we highlight that along with the investment that comes directly from the Pork Checkoff. But I think overall, I'm just really excited about, as you kind of Dan touched on some of the challenges where we've been able to work through that this year in 2025, and we're really where we're setting up to go in 26. Again, I think there's some huge upsides for U.S. pork on the international arena, and just excited to see how far we can take it.
Dan?
Yeah, I think, Andy, you bring up a great point on the market access funds, the government support. But let me make clear one thing for the listeners. One of the most important reasons into why we get a lot of that funding and have for years is the yearly investment we get from the Pork Checkoff. Industry investment is one of the key factors that goes into our application for some of those government funds. If we didn't have that, our application would be much less than what it is today. So thank you for the Pork Checkoff, people paying into that. Without a doubt, it makes a big impact. So if I look at the future here, just to kind of wrap it up, demand globally continues to be at record levels in a lot of countries. Spending power continues to grow. That not only the generic population growth, but the middle class in a lot of these countries that can afford quality. So I'm very excited about the future. I think there's a lot of opportunity, and I think pork in particular is well positioned to capitalize upon it.
Dan Halstrom, USMEF, and Andy Tower, National Pork Board, thank you so much for joining and sharing your insight.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ann.
For you and our audience, we thank you for tuning in today. For more coverage and conversations on pork industry related topics, be sure to check out the Feedstuffs and National Hog Farmer websites, as well as our social media channels. For Feedstuffs and National Hog Farmer, I'm Ann Hess.